That's the idea. I promise you, those bad years will be better.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Good. Good to see you. Jeff is good. How's it going? Good to have you here.
Tom, how are you? Mr. Miller? I know. Yeah, that way.
I know the name.
Good afternoon. In hopes to keep everybody on time and out of here promptly at 6:30, we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a few other folks who might be waiting for, but they'll join us as we're in progress. Welcome back. It seems like we were just at this place just a few days ago, doesn't it? So we did a little homework while we were apart, but all of the homework I know is not done. So bear with us. You've got a lot of questions and things you want additional information on. And in the short amount of time that we had to compile that, most of your questions are answered in this document that was just put at your places when you sat down today. There are some things that are not fully answered yet because we just need a little more time to research, and rather than to give you an incorrect answer, we would prefer to give you no answer or just give you what we absolutely know for certain. So there's a lot here. You'll need to spend some time going back through that and digesting it probably after tonight's meeting, but this will help, okay? And as always, if you have questions, please let us know. Our agenda is before us, and of course this meeting is no different than last. We have a lot of things to get through and get through quickly. So here's how we're going to work today. We're going to have actually 3 sections of presentations from the folks at Plant and Moran, and also from the W. Upjohn Institute, and then another follow-up with Plant Moran. And what we found is there were a lot of great questions being asked last week, but in order to keep us on time with the movement of the information, we're going to ask that you hold your questions until each section of presentation has been done. So Plant Moran will present, we'll do some questions, W. Upjohn, same, and then follow with Plant Moran. In the hopes that by the time you hear the full presentation, maybe some of the questions you have will be addressed, if that makes sense to you. So we'll go ahead and proceed that way. Your agenda's in front of you. Tim, what do we have next? Did I forget anything?
No, I don't think so. I'm going to just do a quick overview of the agenda. So if you think of last time, it was sort of part 1 of getting the necessary background, and we looked quite extensively at Plant Moran at the municipal finances within the state of Michigan, with some points in which we touched on the city of Kalamazoo. Today, we're doing much more of the deep dive on the specific circumstance of the city of Kalamazoo. And so, as Sherry mentioned, we're doing that in 3 parts. What that will set the stage for is 2 other things that we will begin tonight but not conclude. The first of those is looking at what options would be there for increasing the city's financial sustainability. And what I'm going to fairly tightly manage the group to tonight is the last point, and here's why. Between this meeting and the next meeting, we have 3 weeks. I think it's 3 weeks or more. And so what we want to make sure is that we get the thinking of the panel about what additional information that you might want, any research that you might want conducted either on options or what other options might be. And so what we just want to make sure is that we get enough time at the end of the meeting to discuss that, because what that will then do is give Plant Moran, the Upjohn Institute, and the city staff, to the extent necessary, the time they need to get you that information in advance of the next meeting. What you also have is, I just want to take a quick minute on the graphic that you have in your packet. So we are still in the first box of background information and defining the problem. We will begin tonight to get into the second box, which is exploration of potential options or potential solutions. We will not conclude that, but what it will do is set the stage for the first meeting in July, being able to do more work on that, as well as setting the stage for evaluating those options. And to do that, we'll need to generate criteria from the panel about the way in which we will do that. So I'm going to say more about that later in the meeting, but I just want to remind you of kind of where we are. Any questions about the agenda or where we are in the process? If not, then we'll go to an overview of the city's financial challenges. And as Sherry said, we'll do Plant Moran's first presentation, hold questions till the end. You have copies of the presentation in front of you, so jot your questions down as we go, and we'll take them at the end. So with that, I'd like to introduce Scott Patton and Joe Heffernan from Plant Moran for the first presentation.
Hey, thanks. So we've been asked by the city to come and kind of share what our perspective is. To give you a little bit of background of the firm, Plant Moran does a wide variety of services, but on the municipal front, we have probably about 200 different clients that we actively engage in a variety of different areas just within Michigan. And we have some national presence as well. You know, over the last month I've been in Philadelphia, I've been in Illinois, I've been in Cleveland. So we're, do quite a bit of work on both the municipal front and and a little bit more on the state. But we're here to talk to you today about what our experience is at the municipal level. About 10 years ago, Plant Moran had commissioned we were commissioned to give a report by, was it MML? Is that the
Yes.
folks? And at that time, the advice that we gave was basically that the municipal system for financing operations in Michigan is broken. There's a lot of problems. You're not alone in this boat. You're actually at the ahead of the path by trying to tackle this issue head on. But it's been broken for a number of years. It's been broken and gotten worse over the last few years since the recession hit. And we'll talk a little bit about the impact that the recession has had on things as well. My name's Scott Patton. I'm one of the consultants with Plant Moran, and I'm coming at this presentation with wearing a few different hats. For about a dozen years, I was responsible for putting together some budgets for local municipalities. So I was the guy, trying to project what the future looked like and giving some good policy recommendations to a board of commissioners. Since that time, I've been working for Plant Moran and giving advice to the people who are putting together those budgets for the what the future of the organization might be. Also, I have sat in the seat of an elected official and tried to balance what the policy issues are that constituents have when faced with these issues. So, so I kind of wear 3 different hats that and I'll try to give a little bit of information related to each one of those. With me is Joe Heffernan. Joe?
I probably wear a more single-purpose hat. So Scott and I try to do things together because we really do complement each other. He's really looking at it from a budgetary, operational perspective, and I am the accounting and auditing person. I know that I'm going to put somebody to sleep right now by saying that, and I apologize, but then I'm our professional standards head in charge of accounting and auditing for our public sector. And what I view my role here is to be really similar to about 4 years ago. Right after Governor Schneider had been elected, the Michigan Association of CPAs was really proud to have a CPA in the governor's office, and so it created a task force called the Moving Michigan Forward Task Force, and they invited about 15 of the really best CPAs in the state, plus me, to join that. And actually they invited me and one other person because of our background in governments. I've been doing this 36 years, at the time 32 years. And it was interesting, these people were brilliant, just brilliant, not false, like everybody I see in front of me here. But those other 12 were clearly not steeped in government at all, but they had great ideas, which I thought worked really well. The committee, the task force, I think did do very well. And my role there was to try to say, all right, brilliant idea, how do I package that in terms of government and the structure and how it works and that kind of thing. And it was a lot of fun, and that's kind of how I view my role here. As we go through this, Scott put the presentation together, so he's going to take the lead and I'm going to color commentate, if that's the right word. I was probably going to try to handle a lot of the questions that came up, but I see that we're going to be holding those off to the end, and so Scott and I are not going anywhere. We'll go through this relatively quickly because I heard you say you've got a lot on your agenda, and we will also be sticking around as the discussion part of this gets going to try to help with any questions there.
Last comment is, as a revenue panel, we will do our best to focus on the revenue side of the ledger, not the expense side. There will be a couple of times which we'll mention expenses just to illustrate a particular point. Okay, so here is the history and projected future of the city of Kalamazoo. What we have, actually, we were commissioned by Southwest Michigan First a couple of years ago to put together some numbers for all municipalities within the Kalamazoo County, and this served as the basis for the presentation today. What you can see is we are here right now. 2014 has not been audited yet, so we're still using what the estimated figures are. But roughly speaking, the middle of the graph is the past, and the right of the graph is the future. Yeah. And you know, when you think the future is what the city's budget is. So it is what it is that details all of the dreams, hopes, and ambitions that the city has within the constraints that are allowable within state law, state constitution. The top line there is the total revenues, and again, the actual is through 2013. And the next line here, the light blue, is the taxes. This is the property tax portion of things. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time explaining to you the constraints that exist for each one of these different areas, because each one of these lines is very clearly constrained and can only grow at a certain rate in Michigan. And that rate happens to be less than inflation, okay? So that's property tax. The next line here is the other category. Mostly what these are fees for services. Now, if you have if government supplies a service to municipal or to the constituents, like building permits or something of that nature, the government is forbidden from making a profit on that. Okay, so the total cost that it takes to provide that particular service must be equal to or less than what the total cost or what the total benefit is of, that the government gets. So that is the next largest area for the city. After that is intergovernmental sources, what we used to call revenue share. A few years ago, the state changed the name of it, and but the concept was that the dollars that go to the state of Michigan, a portion of that gets reallocated back to municipalities in order to provide services for constituents. And it has been a hotly contested item over the last, well, what, 10 years or so,
Yeah,
really?
well, since 2001, 15 years.
Yeah, and then the last line here is non-operating items. Roughly speaking, what those are transfers into the general fund, okay? So a government can operate a number of different funds for different purposes. Some of those are internal service funds that can have some sort of equity involved in it. And roughly speaking, this last line is transfers that have happened from something like a technology fund back into the general fund in order to support current operations. And you can see there's not much there. There had been a little bit of that transfer that had occurred, but those are one-time expenses or one-time revenues that can't be counted on for any sort of future thing.
And to put that into context, I would just add two things. For anyone that reads some of the materials on the Citizens Research Council or that Michigan Municipal League report back from 10 years ago, sometimes you'll hear the term three-legged stool. Municipal finance is a three-legged stool. It's not counting this brown one, which you can see is pretty small in. Those are the three legs. It's property taxes, state-shared revenue, and then charges. And as we get into those in a little more detail, property taxes really are limited by the laws as to what can be charged. State-shared revenue, we're at the whim of the state. And then the other charges, as Scott said, you can't charge whatever you want under state law. Pretty much, you can charge the amount of what it costs for that particular service or good that's being provided. So all three of those are limited. The other thing I just point out real quickly, when you look at the blue line, I'd go to the big blue, my arm is not that long, but the property taxes, you can see how it's dipped, and maybe that doesn't seem as dramatic, but if you were to take inflation and put it next to it, you'd see the gap, because inflation hasn't stopped. 70%, roughly, more than 70% of the cost of most governments, including Kalamazoo, is people, and that includes pension, healthcare, retiree healthcare. Those things are, Kalamazoo is in a great position for pension because of the overfund. Healthcare, retiree healthcare is not slowing down. It's not an inflationary increase. It's going up much higher than that. And that is the reason why today, in the real big 10,000-foot overview, today in Michigan, most communities have said, okay, 2008 to 2012 were the lost years. We went down, really reset our revenue base. The revenue base that we're allowed to bring in has been reset at some percentage lower. And now, starting maybe 2014, for some 2015, it is starting to go up, and that's good news. But the big picture that everyone's dealing with, governments are dealing with, would be the revenues that are left to us now feel more stable. It's the good news, but they will be going up by something likely less than inflation. And over the long run, the cost side of the equation, people, is not likely to go up less than inflation. And nowadays, people are adding on capital replacement because we've gone 6 years without doing the big capital replacements. You can't do that forever. So really, I would say people and capital, those costs to provide the same level of services are not going to be continuing. And that's kind of a really, really big overview that communities are doing.
One other point with property taxes is that there are actually two constraints that most of the people in this room had voted for at one point. One is Proposal A, and the second is the Headley Amendment. Headley Amendment was enacted in '78. Proposal A in '94. There's a common misperception.
Scott, let me just interrupt you. We had a quite extensive presentation of both of those last time. So if there's questions when we get there, we'll be glad to take them. But otherwise, I think we can move on.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Tim.
So what we have here is the what the demonstration is as far as what the revenues look like when you contrast it with the expenses. And you can see that for Kalamazoo, again, looking at the past as well as looking into the future. The expenses have increased at a rate greater than what the revenues have been, and that's projected to continue. Now we've looked at what the city has projected as far as what the revenue stream will look like, and I can tell you that those assumptions are pretty conservative numbers that's been included in there. So there are very, very minor increases that are projected in terms of things like property tax, fees for service, and the like. But roughly speaking, they are quite moderate, pretty comparable to other jurisdictions, what we've seen. for the future. You can see that the green line is the total total reserves, and that is plummeting quite a bit for it. You want to?
Now, this just, the second graph in this one just shows what I had explained real briefly. That with the revenues going up by a stable or less than inflationary amount, it doesn't look like expenses are going to. And so what that does is, as we saw in the prior graph, the expense line is going faster, and then the green line here is going to cause the reserves to be dropping pretty quick.
No.
Can we back up to that last slide? I had a question. So,
Is that
I'll
okay?
try to be quick. I will be quick. So
Sure.
the expenses, I think we have a sense of why they're going up. Why were they coming down in 2012 to 14?
We'll get to that in a minute. The short answer is position eliminations and successful negotiation on purchasing. Okay. There's a couple of different things that we did. Actually, one other quick point is that the city has roughly about a $7 million fund balance, and that is a target that the city has. It's, what did I say, 13% of what the total revenues are. So when you think about what a healthy organization is, you want to have some savings in the bank. What Kalamazoo has is about 13%. Okay, and from our experience looking statewide, it ranges quite a bit, but that is, it's a pretty common fund balance target. So what has the city done in order to balance things? On the revenue side, it has been pretty limited. If you recall on one of the first graphs there, it did show that the fees for service had increased quite a bit over the course of time, and that was due to a focus on in that area. And then there were some grants that came in. Primarily, those were in 2008, 9, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act grants. One-time revenues that were received by the county or by the city, as well as other municipalities for a variety of different things. Really, those are the two changes on the revenue side of the ledger that have happened. On the expense side of the ledger, there's been quite a bit of
And I'll just say, on that, the fee increases were permanent, but not the era.
Yeah.
The American Reinvestment Act was only about 3 years and done.
So on the expenditure side, one of the things, just a quick, rule of thumb to keep in the back of your head is that for in Kalamazoo's case, personnel costs are roughly about 70% of what the total budget is. Very common. Most governments are somewhere in that neighborhood. And if you think about what government is a service delivery organization. So when you have more people, that means more services provided. When you have fewer people, it means fewer services provided. So one of the things that happened within the city was a pretty significant decrease as far as the number of heads providing services. And that was an initiative that the city called the Early Retirement Initiative. 215 people participated in that and left the city. From that, a number of those positions were left vacant and then subsequently eliminated by the Board of Commissioners. So those are permanent reductions that had occurred. Some of the positions had individuals were recruited for, and those individuals received compensation at a rate that was less than what the positions that they had replaced were. So there's kind of a multiple tier type of thing as far as what the city has. So it's pretty substantial what the shift has been as far as personnel that happened, and that kind of gets to Andrew's point or question just a few moments ago. Another significant change that happened was a healthcare restructuring. We can't speak too much into this. A lot of negotiations that happened. So what our sources are from the communications that happened with commissioners, primarily from Risma's predecessor, and budget documents and the like. So, but there were quite a bit of savings that had been realized from there. And then restructuring funds was another one. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, about that being a strategy that a lot of organizations, a lot of government organizations will go through. In addition to that, there's some things that the city has done for regional collaboration and service contract. And we have 2 examples there, one of which is Consolidated Dispatch, which is a partnership with the county and city of Portage and, am I missing anybody? Is the township involved in that?
Western.
Western, okay, thank you. And that's kind of in process at the moment. Should result in some savings, but from what we looked at, it looked like there's a lot of service enhancement and that's resulted from that. Another interesting one, we've seen this a few times, but one of the things that cities need to do, municipalities need to do, is assess property values. And in the case of the city of Kalamazoo, the way in which they do that is that they contract for that service right now. And we see that quite often. However, when we usually see it, it's with much smaller organizations, small cities, townships, and the like. And the city's able to do that and save quite a bit of dollars through that arrangement as well. So, and there might be some other things of that nature that could happen. But the overall reduction in the number of employees that the city's had, you can see what a dramatic decrease it's been over time. Now we do, like I said, help out a lot of municipalities throughout Michigan. However, this kind of reduction is greater than what we were anticipating when we saw it. Now, one of their initial charts there had your expenses increasing at a certain rate and revenues increasing at a lower rate. What that means is that since the city is a service organization, this reduction is likely to continue unless there's some revenue to support increasing costs.
A lot of our larger urban type cities have had significant reductions, but I think we're probably used to saying 20 to 25%. Still dramatic. I'm not saying that's still pretty dramatic. This is 30% plus. That's very dramatic. It's hard to provide. You can't provide the same level of services with 30% less people.
Well, that's what you can't do it the same way.
Or the same way.
Something's
going to be different.
Yeah, that's the same way.
Can
we just stick to the facts on that? Because that's an opinion that I don't think you're right on.
Gotcha.
Gina. So one of the questions that this group should come to consensus on is what's the target? What is it that you want to shoot for as far as revenue recommendations to the commissioners? Looking at things as far as what the projections look like, you've got $3 million hole just within the next year. Okay, that's quite dramatic, but things are on an incline as far as things like property values and the like. Successful negotiations have reduced what the expenses are somewhat. But even given those successes, I would say, you're still looking at $1 million for the next year and then the year after that. And then it gets a little bit easier, but you're still operating in a deficit. Okay. If you add it up over the next 5 years, you're looking at about a $6 million hole. Now, that hole can be filled with one-time revenues. That is not what we would advise because you'll be in the same boat without that as an option in the future. And very unhealthy type of arrangement. We can all think of some governments that have done exactly that and ended up in bankruptcy court as a result. So the fund balance that the city has is, within these projections is roughly, it's around between 7.1 to 7.4 per year. And again, that's kind of a target that the city has established in order to maintain health throughout the upcoming years. But like I said, it's a cumulative deficit of about $6 million.
Okay.
Ryan?
Questions?
Since we were just on that slide, these deficit projections, does that include like capital expenditures, infrastructure type stuff rather than just maintaining where we are?
Presently, we debt finance capital improvements, and debt service is a part of these numbers on that debt.
Others?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a quick one. I guess maybe I had not been paying close enough attention before, but I was under the impression we were looking at 2.9 next the next year, and then it was gonna be all the way up to like 6 annually by 2020, and it's a cumulative 6 or 5.9, is that right?
So this is all, to the extent you fill the hole permanently in 2016, then you're less 5.9, about 3 million over the next 4 years. So it's, these are annual holes to be filled.
If you come up with 2.9 next year, the following year you have to come up with an additional million. The year after that, you have to come up with an additional million.
So at the end of 6 years or 5 years, we would need 6 million of permanent revenue or adjustments to balance the general fund, based on projections.
6 million annually?
Well, to the extent that it's by the year 2020, if you start from 2016, you will be 6 million, but you are saying that that hole needs to be filled over the next 5 years, but it's cumulative.
But
So
he's
it's not
not
6
talking
million a
about
year.
30 million though.
No, it's 6 million annually.
30 million. He's saying you're not
Ramping
saying.
up to that.
I guess I'm still not understanding. So if we don't pay anything until 2020, we got a $5.9 million deficit.
Annually.
It'll be in every year's
Well, by then it will
budget.
be a $6 million hole to fill
Unless
in
somebody
1
writes
year.
a check for one of those, that'll be subtracted from the budget, sure.
Right.
So I'm gonna ask the question another way. So if you took, so in the 2020 year, how much more than the current tax revenue would you need to balance the budget just for that year? Because I understand it's a $6 million cumulative hole, okay? But what I'm trying to figure out is what it would take on an annualized basis to make it whole, to make you whole.
Well, that's your annualized basis.
If we don't
It's not. You're
accomplish
using-
our goal, that's gonna be $6 million.
You're using the word cumulative, and it's not. You're saying it's accretive. You need 2.9 million every year.
Correct.
In addition, in 2017, you need 950,000. In addition to 2 million plus 950,000, in 18 you need 950,000 more. In addition to those three numbers, you need 400,000. So it's accretive, not cumulative. Cumulative says you need $5.9 million once.
Right.
And it's not. You need
Accretive is the term.
accretive.
I'll trust you on that, sir.
It builds upon each other.
Yes, it definitely
That's,
does.
it's not,
Okay.
it's not additive to each other. It's accretive.
And how we've explained it is, each year that has to be permanent fix. In other words, not a one-time that's gonna come back the next year.
But in 2017, the number is,
Yeah,
Yeah.
2.9
plus
plus,
9.
assuming that 2.9 is permanent.
All right, so if somebody wrote a check for $2.9 million in 2016, and 2017 would have projected a deficit of $950,000.
Correct.
Plus,
No, let me try that. Let me try that again. You're volunteering $2.9 million that you're gonna bring to the city.
So we sold some golf courses.
Okay.
Paid that off.
2.9, next year, you made it through the year, but you still have that deficit. In addition to that 2.9, there's an additional 950,000.
That's pretty serious.
So, correct. So that's why, when we're talking things like position eliminations, those are permanent types of reductions. Taxes, permanent types of increases.
Does this,
Fees.
do the expenses include still paying a full pension to public safety union contract at age 50 and 20 years of service? So funding for that?
Yeah, all the current obligations are factored into these
So the
numbers.
answer is yes.
Yes.
Do we charge any other governmental entity for the costs that our public safety spends on intergovernmental cooperation? In other words, if there's I should be asking you, if there's, like there was 1 week ago, we had that fire at Kendall, and our fire marshal was there, our trucks were there. I understand we do not charge for the cost of providing that service to the township in this case, correct?
Under mutual aid. or.
But I assume that we get called more than,
We
call
can,
them.
that's something we'll have to look into and give research on, because it's like, they can't.
In terms of whether you can charge for it.
Or what the frequency is in relative to townships. Yeah, well.
I understand we can charge for it, but we don't.
We don't.
And so,
So that's a possibility.
that's a question I'd like to have, you know, at the
Yeah,
end
good.
as to what's the statistics of our participation with other entities
Yeah.
Relative
versus,
to
yeah,
them providing for us, okay.
possible revenue sources.
Well, and Tom, what you probably need is both the total and the net, presuming that there's some coming back the other way.
Right.
Yep.
Exactly.
Thank you.
We might want, along with the total and we might want to look at the percentage that represents per year and offset our pension costs related to that. So if
Yeah,
we're
or the other way to
projecting
say it
where
is it'd be a loaded cost. It wouldn't just be the
Correct.
direct, it'd also be the pension obligation against it.
we're- Correct.
Thank you. Matt?
Clarifying question on that first chart you had with the intergovernmental.
Sure.
With the chart being in 2012, did that factor in all the changes that we are undergoing with the personal property tax revenue and replacement?
It did.
Okay.
Yeah. The personal property though would have shown up on the tax side of things.
The light blue line.
Yeah.
And then the revenue sharing, the state aid that is supposed to replace it would be on that orange line.
Okay. But that's factored into this chart?
Correct.
Tom, that was in the projections, right?
We have built in reimbursements for personal property from the state into the tax line for the time being,
Yeah.
until we know exactly what that's going to look like.
So it's represented in the blue line?
Yeah, so that was a policy change, but, you know, when you think about it, it still, you know, comes from tax.
So just to clarify, the reason it looks, it's not a steeper decline or increase in revenue because of that reimbursement is in that blue line.
That's correct.
Yeah. Other questions? And Clinton Rand will be back for a second presentation, so they have other opportunities. But at this point, any questions, any further questions that you have for them? Jim?
Just a point of
Please.
clarification, on the slide that shows the one-time adjustments with the fund reserves going down, you want to explain that we're not legally allowed to have that
Yeah,
happen?
you can't do
Just so
that.
they don't
Can't do that.
think that's an option. Right. So we are legally required to have a balanced budget each year.
Well,
And no deficit fund balances.
Right.
Thanks, Jim.
Well, and what that shows is by 2000, I think it's 17, if I'm looking at it right, the fund balance is gone because you burned it to pay off your shortfall. Okay. Scott, Joe, thank you.
Thank you.
And you'll be back shortly.
Sure.
So I'd like to introduce Brian Patelko from the Upjohn Institute, who's going to give us further perspectives on the financial situation of the city, including its tax base. Brian?
Thank you. So hi, my name is Brian Patelko. I'm here on behalf of the Upjohn Institute. Normally Randy, he was my friend here, but said you could change, but I promise I won't talk about it. So some of the stuff I'm going to show you is a bit of a review from what we've seen, but what we're going to do is take a little longer view in history, and we're going to dive deeper into some of the components of revenue and take a look at some other comparables and kind of put this in a bit of context. So, we'd like to talk a little bit about the scope of revenue generating capabilities the city has had and how we're looking at sort of how it can be sustainable and stable, and specifically in the form of property tax and how that relates with all sorts of different factors, including inflation. We've talked a little bit about how expenses have moved with inflation. We're going to talk a little bit about how property taxes have grown. For example, you know, the city's general fund revenue. So this is just the general fund, and what we've done with this one is rather than take a look at the hard numbers, we sort of indexed it to 2004. Just set 2004 as a base year of 100, and looked at the change as far as and we also adjusted this one for inflation. So at the time for the Midwest urban, the cities of our type, inflation was about 23%. And so revenue and expenditures were, revenue was increasing faster than expenditures for a little while, but it sort of tailed off. And at the same time, tax revenue peaked in 2009. It has fallen dramatically, such that it's fallen faster than both the overall expenditures and all sources of revenue. So the tax revenue for property taxes being our sort of primary source of flexible revenue. We've got a few charts like this. We're going to go all the way a little back further to the 90s now and take a look at how property values have changed. They were growing kind of steadily, assessed and taxable, and the estimated assessed or taxable, and the estimated actual value. So the actual value was tracking fairly closely up until about 2000, at which point it grew faster, not entirely because of the housing bubble. So take a look at prices. Kalamazoo didn't experience the housing bubble the same way that a lot of other communities did, but we definitely fell with one. Because as property tax assessed value grew, because of heavily Prop A, the taxable value did not increase at the same rate. Again, these are indexes, following the same 100. Until about the peak of the housing, when the housing crisis starts, everything's taxable value starts to fall, and the assessed value falls, pushing those down. This only goes up to the audited numbers of 2013. It falls again so far in 2014, and it will probably fall again. So it didn't turn around until 2015. We'll take a look at that in a second. So again, the taxes collected on that, you can see the taxes match. The taxes match the assessment tax will sort of track along with that level, but they don't rise as fast, but they can fall as fast as the assessed actual value. So we did a little projection here, and this has to do with how property values can grow relative to inflation. If property values were to grow, some sort of astronomical amount per year, they can't grow faster than the rate of inflation, which at the moment, so I did a little projection, it's 1.6 in 2021, inflation was about 1.6 in 2015. So far right now, if inflation doesn't change, it's going to be 0% in 2016 due to decreasing energy costs, especially gas prices. But afterward, I predicted about 2%. It basically says we're not going to get back to our peak taxable value until about 8 years out. So it's going to take a while because of the way Michigan allows property tax values to grow. I mean, this is an estimate of 2% of inflation. It's hard to guess how inflation is really going to move. But at the moment, it's going to take a few years for taxable value to get back to where it was. So back to this chart we showed before. We talked about this again with the taxable and the taxes collected on our value. At the same time, intergovernmental revenue has fallen, with the exception of the American Recovery and Investment Act, which they talked about as well. But otherwise, that is a sort of revenue stream we can't really count on. Historically, it was kind of matching. Now, the growth is matching now, not as much. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's take a look at sort of the city as a whole. We're going to take a look at the sources of property tax revenue by parcels. And so these are parcel counts, not acreage counts. So 82% of the parcels are in residential, 9% commercial, 2% industrial, and this is counting Western as one parcel, or this is one parcel. So take that as well, but this of course is exempt either way. So, and then about 6% of parcels are exempt. But we take a look at the acreage of the next one. You can see that the parcel acreage has more or less been somewhat constant. About back in 2000, 72% of acreage was taxable, 28% was not taxable, the breakout is there. In 2014, 67% of our acreage is taxable and 33% is not. The composition is fairly similar. We just have slightly less taxable acreage in the city, but not so humongously different from the past. Let's look a little bit into the specific parcels. If you see these are all the residential parcels in the city with red ones highlighted as ones that gained and yellow lost value. Overall, we've lost about 53 million, in the numbers, in residential value, and 60% of the parcels. So it goes definitely neighborhood by neighborhood. You can see, the north side, West Chill and Winchell have a higher amount of red, where Edison Mill was kind of definitely suffering. But even other areas, I mean, there's lost value in every single parcel or every single neighborhood in the city. It just depends on severity. So we look at commercial values. We're down about 27 million. It's 51% of parcels, about half. The patterns aren't as clear geographically with this one. You can sort of see the red around downtown. Looks like downtown's done a little bit better. The rest of the city is kind of mixed. I guess some of the area along Oakland Drive and Fort is not as. But I don't know, it's harder to glean a neighborhood pattern from this one. Say that downtown looks bad. The industrial parcels, we've lost about $11 million. It's not as large of a part of the city anymore. Less than half, is still close to 46% lost value. There's not much of a pattern to this thing to say that we're down 11, almost 11.5 industrial taxable value. So, how does this compare to the rest of the county? If you look at changes.
Brian, let me just, sorry to interrupt you. The cumulative of those is 91 million. If you add residential, commercial, and industrial, it's 91 million lost tax.
So, if you look at how the decline in property values affected the county, you can see things moving along in the early 2000s. In 2010, the rate of increase slows. In 2010, everything starts to lose value. And 2015 is the first year that it grows in the city of Kalamazoo, whereas in places in other parts of the county, in Portage, Texas Township, Oxmoor Township, the turnaround started at least the year before, 2014, and the rest of the county as well, and their dips weren't as far. So the values in the suburban parts of the county, they grew a little faster, they didn't fall as hard, and they turned around faster, whereas this is an estimate, not getting out of the numbers, but the estimate for the value of 2015 is the first year property taxable value has grown in the city in 7 years. So that's, and as a portion of the county, our taxable value has been, however, declining for a long time. This is relative to the growth of the overall county taxable value. We've been decreasing in our share of that. Even Portage actually has two. We'll look at, if you look at commercial, industrial, and residential, you can see Portage actually sort of flat, Kalamazoo down a little bit, but commercial, we've really been decreasing. Industrial is a bit of a mix, so we've really kind of fallen off on that one. Our contribution to the industrial portion of the county was down significantly in 2003. But generally, all of them, now these don't account for the value of the county rising and falling, this is just our share of that. So we'd also like to take a look at what's happening in other communities. So we've got a few that we're going to look at. So specifically, Washtenaw County, Ann Arbor specifically. Ann Arbor, the property values fell like a lot of people did during the housing crisis. They bounced back almost immediately. Ypsilanti, that's a little more comparable. That fell, but they still turned around. Almost every single part of Washtenaw County turned around faster than we did. With Saginaw, oops, sorry, taking a look at the percentage of taxable property, because we talked about how much of the city is involved in non-tax. We're actually fairly similar to cities of kind of a similar composition. It's close to 70% is taxable. Grand Rapids is about the same. Saginaw's got more taxable, but Holland a little more. But generally, we're not outside the realm of property taxes off the roll.
Can I ask a question? Haven't we heard the number of 47% as non-taxable? That doesn't jive with what we're.
The number 47% includes right away, and it's considered government, but
also not parcels.
It's not parcels, or
this might be part of the acreage.
So they looked at actual non-right-of-way acreage.
Yep, like usable acreage. And,
Qualified useful.
well,
Can we go back to that?
Yeah, can you go back at those slide that, you're saying 88% of Saginaw is not taxable?
Tax-
It is taxable, all right.
I think it's the industrial one.
Yeah.
I mean, Saginaw's major universities elsewhere.
No, that's, yeah, I did that same.
And so as far as tax incentives, this is something that I don't want to, this one we're definitely a lot higher than some of our comparison areas, especially the more recent. They've been declining in popularity. Saginaw is offering more. And then now we're sort of the leader. And we're sort of, at this point, well ahead of some of the other cities in Michigan. So I don't mean that it's about $1 million, but I mean, I would not want to speculate whether or not businesses would be here in the absence of growth. So
I can tell you, they all signed deals that said they would.
Right.
So we can't say that, they signed deals that they would be.
Right, so I don't.
You also should point out, none of those places had industrial growth.
Right. So
At
I
that
don't,
time.
we want to discuss it, but we don't want to indict this conflict. We want it out there because we are. That is still sort of the portion of our.
This is from IFTs, not TIF, right?
These are IFTs. Sorry. So just the observations, to sort of sum up, taxable property has been declining. The percentage of taxable property went down from 72 to 67%. All of the categories of commercial, residential, industrial all suffer declines in the city. And the city's share of taxable value has gone up. So the property value is really what we were trying to kind of drive home with this one. That it's just not where it used to be, and it didn't turn around as fast as other areas did. And that's one of the biggest drivers of the general fund revenue. So, yeah.
What questions do you have for Brian?
And I'm gonna write this down.
I have a question.
Yep.
Thanks, man.
I want to go back to, I think it's, page, no, it's not 10. Where you, in your analysis, you said that, it's on page 11. It says, some neighborhoods have been hit harder than others, as in Millwood have widespread decline in income on property taxes.
This is the value of the parcel and whether or not it's growing. It doesn't actually come from the size of the growth either. So any parcel that grew is highlighted red. And not to say that there hasn't been, I mean, any red dot is colored in any red dot is growth, any yellow dot is declining. So,
Do you have a further question, man?
I'll ask them later, but.
oh, and
No,
Go ahead, you do.
knowing the property values have dropped on the north side, and you're saying that.
well, some of them have grown.
With the foreclosures, they were buying properties for $3,000. Now they're charging residents $7,000 rent. They bought the properties for like $3,000.
Well,
These were properties that were.
our assessed, I mean, what I guess our assessed, we
They
usually
were
assess
normally
the
much
taxable
higher.
value change from 7 to 14 on the parcel level. So I'm not certain actually.
Actually, Manny, it may be the length of time because they looked at a 7-year period, not just a shorter period that might have been impacted. But
Right. I mean, that might have been, and even if there was, good question, if it dropped, I mean, we measured from here to here, if it dropped and a purchase of property was acquired and bought again at the lowest point, it might still look like it rose even if it dropped in the same time period.
And this is based off of the assessed values, correct?
Yeah, well, the taxable.
Yeah.
Taxable.
That doesn't always capture the foreclosure sales in the way that we think of the market. The assessment, the way they do it, doesn't always capture those $3,000 sales. As far as that translating into assessed values that these numbers are based on.
I guess what I'm looking at is that ultimately then there were demolitions. So after that first year, so even if you went a 7-year time span.
Well, that's a good point. If any,
The demolitions came, and after a year, then those property values dropped down because the demolitions were there. They are very consistent for at least 5 years as well. I know that.
Yeah.
Did you want to speak?
well,
to
the year-to-year changes might be something we could look at rather than, and the other thing is that if the value of a rentable property goes up, that might be affecting some of the properties. I'll look deeper into this.
Thank you. Yes, Deborah.
I'll wait till you finish.
Oh, sorry.
No, no. I'm not sure if you're the right person, but the nonprofit sector that doesn't pay property taxes, do they contribute any revenue? Are there payments in lieu of taxes that some nonprofits pay?
For the housing ones, yes, otherwise, no. Pilots in Michigan are tied to affordable housing development, period.
That's the only
Under state law.
nonprofit entity that pays some equivalent of taxes.
They either have a MISTA or a HUD mortgage / relationship of some kind.
Is that of any significance, do you know, that amount?
We'd have to, we'll look into that.
I mean, the amount of tax exempt properties has gone up slightly, but they were there too.
However, don't you factor in that if a nonprofit owns, let's say particularly in housing, and then they charge rent, then that property then becomes taxable. Anytime they collect any rent.
So your head should be correct. I'm not certain, but I'm seeing your head should be.
All affordable housing collects rent. So, but none of them, affordable housing is not.
I mean, how are you finding that? Just my question is, there are some sectors of the nonprofit world that do make payments in lieu of taxes, and I just don't know how widespread that is.
But I think the largest nonprofits are not what you're talking about.
Right.
I can answer, I can give it to
Mike, go ahead, please.
The way we look at it is if you're a not-for-profit but have some for-profit activity, you pay property taxes on that for-profit activity.
Right. Yeah.
For example, Bronx is a pretty big system, and overall we pay $2.4 million a year on property taxes. On either facilities or land that's not used for nonprofit activity, or businesses where it is for-profit. Like our medical practices are for-profit. So any medical offices, you would pay property taxes on that. Vacant land used for nothing, you would pay property taxes on that.
And the driving force for being not-for-profit, especially in education and healthcare, is that you provide other services to the community in lieu of paying tax. Right. Both hospitals pay about $40 million in their cost to provide charity, approximately.
Right.
Employ a number of most important medical school to the tune of about $20 million a piece. So there's other things we have to improve that we develop with your community benefit in lieu of tax. So that's usually what we can compare those two.
Thank you.
Tim, it should point out too, the not-for-profits, they only don't pay tax if they own a building. We don't own our building, we clearly pay property tax that's factored in to that. And the vast majority of not-for-profits do not own their own real estate, so they are paying taxes through the rent they're paying.
Yeah.
And that would be captured in our commercial property.
Yeah. Yeah, an example of that would be when the Kalamazoo Community Foundation was in the America building, they were paying taxes by paying rent to America. So it's just same as Southwest Michigan first as a tenant.
Yep. Couple questions?
Please.
So Brian, on your observations.
Yes.
Percentage of tax, point two, percentage of taxable property has declined from 72 to 67%. Is that in terms of dollars or acreage?
I believe it's acreage.
So we're saying that 5% of the total acreage has come off the tax rolls.
Right.
What percentage of that went to either local government entities or land bank?
Not in my control.
So it could be 100%.
Could
And then on the .3, little change in taxes on property owned by not-for-profits, but the share of property owned by schools has increased. So we're essentially saying that that's Western K and KBCC, or is that Kalamazoo Public Schools, which has grown dramatically?
It could be, yes. I'm not, I can,
Because what I'm trying to do is there's a lot of, I have lots of perceived biases, so if you say schools, I immediately go, gosh, I can't remember Western taking that much, and we forget that we all voted, or lots of people voted for bond issues to grow school districts, to build new facilities, and that's in this number, so.
yeah, I mean,
Medical school would be in that number too, wouldn't it, Ron?
The medical school
Would come
would-
off, they came off the record.
Yeah, but it actually came off earlier, but yeah, it would,
Well-
at some point.
Yeah, but it was a previously taxed
It was a
property.
previously taxed, but it actually came off before this data. And then shares of, city share Kalamazoo taxable property value steadily declined during the past 10 years. So we're comparing city of Kalamazoo
to the
versus
county.
other
Well,
jurisdictions?
in the county, yeah. So the city's share of taxable value as the amount of taxable value to be had in the county.
That number's always gonna go down because the city's run out of development space. So unless you see negative growth in surrounding jurisdictions, that's a trend that's gonna continue because the city, we're out of.
It's landlocked.
Yeah, landlocked, and we don't have a lot of parcels that we're going to add. And if we were, we're not gonna add industrial, we're gonna add residential just by the sheer nature of our current policies. So I'm not sure that's, I don't want anybody to think we're gonna reverse that easily.
Well, and not all these are things I think we can reverse, but they're just in the context of, these are the challenges, and this has been happening here, the challenge for state.
So it's analytically true, Ron's point is it doesn't necessarily represent an opportunity.
It isn't, we can't reverse that and say, well, we'll just reverse that number and we won't need new revenue because there's our new revenue.
Other questions for Brian? Okay, Brian, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And let's ask Scott and Joe to come back for the second portion of their presentation. And Brian, if you might stay, please, in case as we get to further questions, we go back.
All right, so we saw the size of the target and how it's growing over time. And then the central question is, what do you do, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about what other governments have done throughout Michigan. And then we'll, throw out some ideas for you to think about in the next slide. And as I understand the city's process, we've got, two different groups. There's the revenue group that, looking at revenue opportunities, and then there's also budgeting by outcome group that's kind of looking at some expense options, including a couple that's been brought up today. And so, when you think about how the city of Kalamazoo has addressed past deficits, it's all been on, this side of things. And common, we see a lot of, efficiencies. Deferring costs is a very, very, very common thing. You just stop, this is what the state of Michigan did with highway system. You stop fixing streets, and then eventually things get bad where people want to, see the nature of it, so they want to really get at it. It's very difficult for people to actually, or for government to actually eliminate services. A lot of what government does is mandated, and a lot of it is, very dependent on, or people dependent on it for their livelihood. Tough thing to do, but it does happen from time to time. So we're going to focus on the revenue options here, and with that, one of the common first steps is to, get some good accountants, hire them, and bring them in to take a look at where some.
One question.
Yeah.
What are the categorical costs?
If you think about any organization, you've got kind of the silos here. You've got public safety, you've got central services, and so forth.
Is that what we're talking about here?
No. So for those, if you eliminate one of those services, that's getting rid of one of those silos. For categorical costs, you're looking at it across the board. Technology, personnel, healthcare, those sorts of things. And a few of those, as we mentioned before, the city has not. So yeah, just a different way of looking at an organization. So one of the revenue options is restructuring debt. When that interest rate hits a certain level, you resell stuff, and hopefully that'll save some dollars. There's also some cost allocation accounting that can occur. For grant dollars, if you can figure out a way to attach particular expenses to that particular grant, it can end up increasing the amount of revenue that comes in. Relatively low levels, but still it's a very common first step in a lot of organizations do.
On the debt restructuring, that could include, as we talked about the capital improvement program being financed primarily by debt. I know the city has had a combination of some limited tax versus unlimited tax. The unlimited tax type of the debt requires a vote of the residents, but it does give the ability to levy a millage sufficient to pay that debt. And most people that are looking at municipal finance view that as a revenue source. I know residents don't like hearing about it that way, but quite honestly it is, because it allows you to go past that 20 mills you have and say, I've got a new dedicated millage that's going to be sufficient to pay that debt because the voters approved the specific bond issue.
Use of fund balance is something that's very common and not something we necessarily advise for. When you think about the health of an organization, there's that ratio between what you got in the bank versus what the expenses or what the revenues are that you have coming in. If those start to decrease, then your total fund balance can decrease at a proportionate level, and you'll still be just as healthy as what you were before. But unfortunately, a lot of municipalities will look at that and say, you know what, we're going to get through this year and maybe buy our way through the next election, and not a healthy thing to do. But it is pretty common. Increasing fees, we mentioned that was one of the strategies that the city has already done. There might be a couple of others out there, I'm not sure. We haven't gone through on a cost by cost basis.
So an example of that would be the mutual aid idea that somebody at the table brought up earlier. And there could be some other pieces like that. It's worth looking at everything, turning over every rock we've got, and it might add up to something meaningful.
Increasing taxes is an option on the municipalities will go to, and we'll talk about a couple of those ideas in a minute. And then borrowing is kind of at the last level that works.
And generally that means what I think you're already doing, using borrowing to fund the capital improvements rather than out of cash. Not borrowing to fund operations. That's, for the most part, not legal in Michigan unless it's an emergency loan from the state, but sometimes on a short-term basis, if communities are used to paying cash for the capital items, saying maybe for a few years we borrow. That doesn't work forever because it just increases the debt service, and totally you may end up paying more than if you had funded it yourself.
Okay. So some strategic options that are there. I understand that at the last meeting there was a discussion about a Headley override option. That is something on the table. I think there was even an estimate of it that was included in the handout that you had. Tough to do. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that the public really votes on too frequently. And I've seen several of them go down. I can't think of too many that have been successful.
If I had to guess, I'd say like a third have been successful. It does happen, but the voters have to feel you've done everything else you can, and this is like, now you've come to us. Yeah. You're right. The ones that just say, we have a problem, let's have a Headley override, go down pretty quickly.
Tim, have we seen data on what that would generate?
think it's in your packet.
Yeah, it
And just as a reminder, I won't get the fraction exactly right, but there was a rollback because of deadweight, and I think the current level of mills is 19.027 or 0.2705. So it basically would be what's the revenue generated if we did an override to restore what's approximately 3/4 of a mill. But it does take a vote.
Special assessment districts are also something that, that we see from time to time. And especially on things like street improvement projects, those are relatively common for them. And that takes a vote of the people within the particular street in order to
Not a ballot type election, not at the polls, but a petition type process. And there are some communities, particularly for streets, that have kind of said, we all know that the road money under Act 51 hasn't been sufficient in years, and by golly, we'll use it for maintenance, but we're not going to use it. We're going to stop using Act 51 for road reconstruction, repaving, that kind of thing. Will always be special assessments. That's one of the strategies that we see.
I was just going to say, is it typically only for roads, or are there other uses that special assessment districts?
There are other uses. Generally speaking, a special assessment has to convey a special benefit to a group of property owners. Townships which aren't able to use the Act 298, the rubbish village, which comes already have, that would be a common one for a township to say, you want rubbish pickup? Do it through a special assessment. Kalamazoo is already using the Act 298 mills. But it could be smaller things. Streets is a big one, but it could be other smaller things. That would be a special benefit that's been given to just a certain proportion, a certain portion of the.
And there's some similar instruments for like a downtown development authority type that you can use as, if it's specific for that particular area. Income tax. So there's, 30 jurisdictions throughout the state of Michigan that have an income tax. It requires a vote of the people. None have passed that within the last 30 years. I'm not even sure of any that have gone to the ballot, but I can tell you there has been quite a bit of curiosity of late within municipal finance.
It's obviously a big one.
Ben Harbor just tried to do it last year, I believe.
Yeah.
Ben Harbor had one on the ballot, it failed last year.
It's potentially a big one. I think based on what Scott said, with in the last 30 years all going down, it would have to be done carefully, and probably would have to be a mixture of giving up maybe some property taxes in lieu of it. I'm guessing if we just said, hey, let's have a new income tax, it's pretty difficult.
Theirs was not. It was not well articulated how that was going to be used, and I think that was one of their challenges.
Do we have any clue at all what that sort of, like say, 1% income tax would potentially generate? Do we have any data available?
That's, one of the options, we can, if it ends up being on your list, if you want to.
You said you didn't hear that the question is whether there's any data already available, roughly, kind of like that, as to what 1% income tax would bring in?
There have been some very rough estimates run a couple of years ago in collaboration with Adam Rujan from Plant, and also W.F. John assisted with that.
Why don't we put that on the research list and bring it back to the, I think it's a good question. Whether we pursue it or not, it'd be good to have that information. So let's put that on the list for next time.
Well, I think the nice thing about having that information is, people throw out 1%, but maybe 0.5% or 1/4%.
If we're gonna go ask for anything, if we haven't at least investigated every single option, then we're not gonna have any credibility.
Yeah, and let me just say a word too. After these gentlemen get through this, we've done some work since the last time on the matrix that Ron suggested last time, so I think that's going to be a vehicle for looking at what these options are and so on. So, but please go for it.
But if we're gonna get what that income tax would, then I'd like to see data on the economic decline of those communities that have the income tax, because I will tell you that it's far greater than what we've seen in this region. So I think we're going to look at what the revenue side is.
Well,
We need to look at what the loss is.
That's the pros and cons.
That's a great point. been 30 years, it's tough to, I mean, we need some help.
So you can't look at it all as new revenue.
Operating millage is another one. And something Jill and I chatted out on the drive down is that, you know, some jurisdictions for a particular service basically get out of that business, and we've seen it in fire service especially, where the city says, you know what, we're no longer going to provide fire. We're going to do a joint authority with our neighboring jurisdictions, and then that authority has the authority to go to a millage in order to fund that particular service for it. So that's something that that's.
So if we get some kind of that already raised the millage, does that affect us on property or the other ones that live in our villages?
The other communities we've seen do that have viewed their 20 mills that were already in their city charter as still being available for everything else. So from that sense, it does free that up. I have not seen that tested in court as to, wait a minute, is that fair or not? But I've seen it done. So again, I'm trying not to give a legal opinion.
So
I'm not suggesting it's not. That's a really good question. And I have seen it done with communities that have spun that off and said that's now a separate district library, fire authority, whatever that would be. That's right, with its own millage. And now the city still has its original millage unchanged and can now use that for the remaining core services.
I'm sorry, Carl, could you just...
Based on the conversation about cost of being delayed, that might be interesting to consider.
There, for in Kalamazoo's case, there were no operational barriers because you have a combined fire and police, but it's definitely worth exploring. That's what the response is.
What departments are eligible for that?
Yeah, that's,
Just by
so police could be included.
correct.
Yes.
Correct.
I haven't seen any police happen. I've seen it talked about. It clearly is in the universe.
Does this require votes?
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think about it this way. Let's, well, I'll take a personal example that I was involved in. A community where I live partnered with 3 neighboring townships to create a fire authority. And that particular fire authority went to the vote, or went to the people for a vote, and it passed. And so that village was generated.
All 3 jurisdictions?
Yeah, all 4. Yeah.
Let me ask a question, and you may not be able to answer. Can the boundary of the authority be the same as the boundary of the city, or does it have to span multiple jurisdictions?
That would be a good follow-up question.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
I'll answer it this way. I've never seen an authority that is identical to the jurisdiction. I've never seen that, but I don't know whether or not it's possible.
Kalamazoo does have such an authority for transit, but it's a different boundary with the cities.
Correct. So that we've seen a lot. That's the most common.
The key is that the millage has to pass a vote of the people within the boundaries of the authority. So it's still an election.
Yeah, think of it as creating a different governmental unit that's only responsible for that one particular service. And because you're only responsible for that one particular service, it has its own boundaries for it. So. And then there's lots of other smaller things we can think of that, you know, the city might want to think about. We have sort of a checklist of stuff that we sit down with clients on, and so we'll give you that. But there's clearly not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of brainstorming going on throughout the whole state of Michigan when it comes to the revenue question.
Andrew?
I want to throw something out there. It may not fit under your typical CPA revenue mindset, but I don't hear any discussion about growing the pie. So we have a residential market analysis that shows there's a demand for 1,000 units over 5 years. What happens if you build 1,000 units in 5 years? How much revenue do we need? How much taxable property do we need to close that gap? And it's probably wouldn't do it alone, but I don't know.
And the question I would look at is with those 1,000 units, where do you fit in the scale of the local income ranges? What would the average taxable value of those units be? You can't add, you can't grow the tax base for
I'll say you're talking density. Again, talking about multiple units going this way, not going this way.
I can think of 6 parcels downtown that you could generate a couple $100 million of value on if you built them dense.
Who's the you?
What do you mean
You
you?
said you. I can
If they were built densely, I'm not suggesting this is within the purview of this group to build this, but.
Well, but it comes back to, under your question number 5, it indicated that the city assets, both performing and non-performing, if sold, then it would be a one-time revenue and it doesn't list the assets. Potentially, there are assets that the city could incentivize somebody to build on that would, over time, actually produce some positive income. And we're not even discussing that list, so I think we need to come back to that.
I think that's the silver bullet.
So we definitely want to put in infill as one of the options.
Yeah, let me just throw out, I think that is a great suggestion, because what it reminds me of is what has happened with the city of Birmingham. Not necessarily because of something they did. I hear you saying you should be more active in making it happen, but the city of Birmingham is my example of a community that was built out 30, 40 years ago, and yet their taxable value is growing because people are clamoring to get in there. They're knocking down both businesses and residences. They're coming in, knocking down, building something new, and so their taxable value is, in fact, as a percentage of Oakland County, is actually growing in this built-out community. Now, that's not because of something they're part of it, but it's really happening to them. And what you're saying is maybe Kalamazoo could kind of make that happen. A downtown rejuvenation with something that's a little bit denser.
But I think, yeah, a better example that we all understand, I think Commissioner better, is the medical mile in Grand Rapids, where the community, through its giving up tax base through the medical community, the hospitals, investing strategically in a high concentrated area, have now seen a booming of high density residential and the retail that is required to service that high density residential. So where we're finding ourselves at a trough, we've already made that investment. We've seen that, and it's now coming online. So if we create an expense strategy that outprices the market, then we're not going to see the benefit of the investment we made as a community. So I think it goes beyond just, weren't they lucky? It was, no, it was strategic. Back to Andrew's point, that's why the urban committee is doing so much work around what's the housing demand. Housing demand is almost zero without the medical community. So it's medical and Western that's driving that housing demand. So I think there's great, to Carl's comments, there's stranded assets that the city, by putting those into the marketplace, have the opportunity to generate revenue from that isn't a one-time fix. It's an annual, it's an annuity. A tax base comes on forever, maybe a declining annuity as we're seeing with some of our other tax bases, but it's an annuity that can deliver for decades, much stronger than simply asking people who are on tight budgets to pay more.
So let me make this suggestion. Scott and Joe are going to be here, but I just want to see, are there any more questions for them now? Because what I want to try and do in the time we have left is continue to see if there's options we can generate, and also to make sure that we're clear about the research and background that we need to do between now and the next meeting. Further questions for Scott and Joe? Good.
On your checklist, are there city services that can be added to
None beyond the cost of providing that service.
So it would have zero positive impact.
We might be able to produce revenue while including cost of providing that service, we increase efficiency from the things we already do. For instance, Domino's Pizza makes more money by adding chicken because it goes through the same oven. They didn't have to add anything to be able to deliver chicken, but they're getting $6 extra for a grocery pizza, and that's whole business. Right? So how do we consider where we may see those efficiencies, limit infrastructure increases, deliver more services to people, where we gain a better deliverability of the service we're
No, the only thing that hits me, maybe I'm too simple-minded because I'm the accountant, but you talk about the things you're already doing. I think of some of the services, your building department, et cetera, can they be used for some of the townships and cities surrounding? But that's, yeah.
Our public safety requires a massive infrastructure for data transactions, and it's underbuilt as it stands. In fact, it's so underbuilt it fails a lot. And we have backup contracts that cost a ton of money to operate that we're asking our residents to pay for, because our current infrastructure requires a backup system that comes from a vendor who's charging whatever the hell we want. That's not reasonable. Should we consider city-wide fiber that becomes a city service that we can ask people to help pay for? We no longer need that third-party backup because we can use the city fiber in connection with the public safety fiber. At which point now we've got a better use of the general fund to be able to provide the same services in the city.
Would that go beyond the city? Another
At which
place
point,
would take
and in the process of bidding that to make it available citywide, there's also the piggyback that goes in there where there's a new revenue generation opportunity to lease that infrastructure to a private provider that could provide other things on the same city infrastructure. I mean, we're not going to get more money for doing less. It ain't going to happen. We got to get creative and think about what we're going to do. Nobody wants to pay more money for the same stuff, and nobody wants to pay more money for less stuff. So if we're asking our citizens to figure out how to help us go forward, we have to actually go forward.
So let me just see if, are there further questions? I want to get into the option generation, so, which is what Carl's point is, but are there further questions for these gentlemen before we do that? Deborah?
I'm not sure it's for them, but just building on Andrew's infill. I feel like we need to have an understanding of whether the city of Kalamazoo is welcoming to new businesses or is more in the business of obstacles, because that can vary greatly from city to city. And I think that yeah, yes. So that I think, along with the because infill with for-profit businesses along with residential is important, but I don't have a sense of how well the city is set up to say yes, please come.
Isn't the city of Kalamazoo participating in the program that says it's called
Redevelopment
Ready Communities, where they actually look at their zoning codes and all of the things that would make it easier for business to come in. So that information should be pretty easy to get, because Kalamazoo has been working on that for over a year. It's called Ready.
This isn't part of our discussion, but the discussion about rezoning and zoning should not be limited to the city of Kalamazoo. If we really want to grow, we need to grow as either a county or a region, and that will impact the city. So I think that conversation may not be here, but I agree with Maddie. These are the things that we need to look at.
I'm going to throw something in on the zoning piece, getting back to that revenue and density piece. You know, I don't know the answer to this, but if somebody wanted to build a home, an accessory structure for the mother-in-law on their lot in Winchell, could they do it? For example. So what constraints are there in the current zoning that could stop us from adding more value on existing land? It's probably different, you know, in each, you know, R1, R2, whatever. But
It really wasn't a barrier at all. I did that for my mom to add it on to my home.
question answered, I guess.
There wasn't a barrier. I mean, had to pay the regular fees, and yes, my taxes went up, but I mean.
God bless you. That's what I'm talking about. That's what the American dream looks like.
I'm not volunteering to build one for.
It was working to me because my mother lived 9 years, 4 months longer than what the doctor said. So it wasn't personal. So it was working to me.
Any other questions for Scott and Joe? So if not, I'm going to suggest we continue our discussion. And please, gentlemen, you're not totally off the hook yet. Well, what I'm distributing now is a first attempt to fulfill the request that Ron made last time, which was creating a matrix that would let us look at different revenue options. Now, what you're going to see is this is a structure that's largely unpopulated. The only populated portion of it are the few ideas that were in the last meeting summary, okay? But what I want to do with the time we have left is to see if there are any additional options for revenue generation. And then what I want to do is to think about any further requests that people have for work to be done between now and the next meeting, so that we've got the information we need to pursue it. So obviously we've come up with some already this evening that can be added to the first column. Infill being one, looking at whether providing additional services would give us cost efficiencies, looking at the extent to which, so I won't try to summarize them all. I have them in my notes as I did this summer. So other ideas that people have, and this is not last call by any means, but I just want to take whatever thoughts people might have of other revenue generating opportunities.
Well, do we talk a little bit about creating a different district or authority that we could remove the millage from the current cap where we are and give us room underneath that?
Basically an authority to provide a specific service that would, in effect, allow the total millage for the city to exceed 20, or to exceed 19 point.
So we don't have to hit the cap.
Okay.
We have to remember to sell that idea. We have to sell the efficiencies for everybody rather than to generate more revenue.
Right.
So we come back.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess in connection to that, I'm sure it's in your notes, but just to clarify, we want to look at what sort of mutual aid we're giving to others that we could potentially be capturing revenue from.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's actually, cost recovery on mutual aid. Okay, good.
Tim, I do have a question.
Good.
Being the account, I always look at, are we really allocating our costs to those services appropriately? I think the last meeting said that the folks looked at it, and I found that there's a lot of ways to allocate costs that are realistic, but you can gain some additional revenues from your fees. And so your costs don't change, you just allocate it and raise your fees appropriately. And if they've done that, if they have, that's fine. If they haven't, look at it again.
We have a cost recovery plan that is updated, and that's the basis for how we charge it out. But that's continually being worked on. So.
Good. Others? Yes, Jim?
We had property taxes that have gone down, over the last years. But when they get challenged, we don't do it at city status anymore, right? We go to the state level for the tax, or go ahead, Tom.
The process hasn't really changed. It's just that we used to have a city staffer, a city assessor who would manage that Board of Appeal process here. Then the state would take over to the extent that there was a secondary appeal to the state. Now we have our contracted assessor who manages that process in-house for us with the board reviews in March and July and December. And then secondary appeals to the state go from there. So it's still the same process, we just have we have a contracted assessor now handling the first part locally as opposed to an in-house assessor.
Do you have a sense or a feel that that is the best deal for the city?
It's worked really well, actually. I was not looking for a contracted assessor at that time. We were looking to hire an in-house assessor, but we utilized our WCA for field services already. So they had a master assessor who was available for us, and we've now used him for a couple of years, and he's actually done a tremendous job with some very tricky appeals that in the past had really caused us a lot of headaches and caused us to spend a lot of money on appraisals, and just saved us some money on not having to do appraisals on some recent large appeals because of the work he's done. So it's been a good process with that.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Tom. Others? logical option, not an advocacy position.
Absolutely not an advocacy one, and not tied to my employment in any way, certainly. I was just in Chicago for the weekend, and in a far-flung neighborhood from downtown, staying with my brother-in-law, and they have to pay to park their car on the street. Every single person that lives in the city does. Seems a reasonable thing to me. Everyone is paying for the cost of building that infrastructure, but not everyone is using it to park their cars. So residential parking fees is, in my mind, worth considering.
So Tim, in that same, I'd like to see a list of what, and this will take art, not science by the staff, of stranded city assets, those that have economic value but are not being utilized by the city, or that no longer have city needs. You know, we've said we have an excess golf course. What are those other things? But then also look at what are those enterprise funds that the city may end up doing that have potentially higher and better value, in particular parking. So with that, you say, well, if we sold the parking lot, that's a one-time cost, unless you put a large building on it. And then it's no longer a one-time cost. The city's never gonna have the revenue to develop that, but certainly if we build the market, parking goes underground on the first 2 levels, and we build above that, that becomes a asset that's annuity for the city. So better understand.
We probably need to know what the limitations are zoning-wise on that too. If there's what the restrictions are, how tall can we build a building?
So actually,
Parking isn't traditionally a governmental function in most places. We're an anomaly in this day and age. So is that a revenue source of operating that takes less city resources to manage, puts it in the private sector so it becomes taxable, and then particularly if it's sold as a development property, not continuing surface parking?
So I just want to make sure, so what you're really looking at there though is not privatizing parking. You're looking at selling parking for commercial use, or are you looking at both?
I think both.
Yeah, it could be both.
Okay.
It's a non-core activity. You know, when I went to public administrator school, they taught us that our job is to provide for the public what the public can't provide for themselves. So clearly, police and fire are one of those issues the public can't, by and large, do themselves. Parking is not one of those issues. In most cases, the private sector has the capacity, the ability, and the market dictates prices.
Thank you. Okay, yes, ma'am.
And I just want to be sure this revenue option, that, is there somewhere in here about city income tax?
Yes.
So which one is that?
Well, actually,
Is that in that second column?
what I'm assuming is that everything that they just reviewed as strategic options would be added to this. So it's not included in one of these at this point. These were just a few things that were mentioned last time. So based on the input of this meeting, I think we've got to do 2 things. We've got to expand the revenue options so it includes these things. And then that's going to have to lead to some analysis. Tom?
Ron raises an interesting question with these stranded assets. Do we have stranded services that the city is providing that really doesn't need to be provided? And if so, what are they and what's the cost associated?
So that is priority-based budgeting, and we are going to be rolling that out this summer through the city commission. And basically taking everything the city does around the programs, services we provide, and breaking them out into quartiles. So the 4th quartile would be the lowest priority, lowest impact, again, based on the community priorities that we've identified or resolved. And so that's all going to be part of this upcoming budget process, and that's the basis for the discussion around what is the city doing right now that really isn't being impactful and maybe isn't part of our core mission, and that becomes the basis of what we talk about. So but that's a separate process, again, around the expenditure side. But kind of dovetails with the revenue side, the resource side of, okay, here's what we can do with more or different revenue, and it just provides a way of tying it together, I think, in a way that people can see, demonstrate what we're doing, not just, you know, a budget book that there's 300 pages that no one really looks at, so.
So Tim, is the idea then with that, so I come back to the 5.9 accretive annual. So if we have a group, what's their budget goal? Is their budget goal to hit the 5.9 million deficit?
So the budget goal for which?
For revenue, or for the expenses. So if we're doing zero-based budgeting, at what point do they stop and draw the line and say, okay, we can't do anything past it? Is it the 5.9 million, or is it the zero deficit line?
So the way I envision it is that chart that showed the reoccurring revenues and reoccurring expenses, that's the structural gap that we're looking at. The recurring expenses are the operational side of what we're doing. And again, we're going to look at that relative to priority-based budgeting. It's the structural revenue side that is the challenge, and that's what we're trying to do, is get our reoccurring revenues in line with our recurring expenses as we go forward. So those two, in other words, our costs go up, we need revenues that grow commensurate to that cost, or else we're always going to be cutting, and we can't cut our way out of this like we have in the last 10 years without severely impacting service, which we're not, you know, we're going to continue working on that, but it's identifying that structural issue, that imbalance that we're trying to get at. And that's a structural issue relative to the municipal finance model that we're operating under in the state. And that's really what this is about.
So this work that you're going to be, upcoming budgeting work, could affect those numbers?
Sure, if we can find, we're always going to be looking at operational efficiencies and that. And, you know, those are projections. We're really trying to get this on even keel, because beyond that, we just want this community to grow and not have to every year look at how we're going to continually do concessions. We got employee pay increases that haven't gone up in the last 5 years, and you know, we've been able to do that because of the economy. But over time, that's not a model I can live with either, because over time we're going to lose talent in this organization. So you got all that feeding into this.
Yeah. Well, I just think that, you know, we're doing all this transparency. If this group comes together and says we're going to go out and ask the residents of the city to vote on something, to pay a tax, to increase a millage, whatever, it seems to me that, I mean, it makes sense to me that we should know what that nut is that we're trying to cover.
Right.
We should be solid on it. And so the kind of the work that you're doing, it seems like it should be running concurrent with what we're doing.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
And that's going to come back together when we get to the summer months. We'll have this priority-based budget. We can run that through here too, you know, just so you can kind of see what we're up against. That's a separate process we're going to be undertaking with the commission later this summer, but I think it kind of speaks into what we're talking about here, just so you can get the complete picture. And but that's why the idea is for these to come together, and we just needed a group to come together on the revenue side, because as you can see, this isn't something you can just do in a 2-hour meeting at we need some minds around this and look at all these options, and what's viable, what's not, what's legal, what's not, and that's what we want to accomplish out of this group.
So let me say a word about that. When we look at this gap as it's quantified at 5.9 or 6, I mean, just to round it to 6 or whatever, that doesn't, I mean, I think what that's based on is current numbers. And I think we've got to take that as a working assumption. Now, if there's things through priority-based budgeting and so on that gives us some help with that, great. But I think for us to I think it helps if we keep our focus on revenue. And the good news is we've got a parallel track, and obviously it does have to come together. But so I think it's good if this group's informed about that. But I think if we get too deep into the priority-based budgeting thing, we're not gonna necessarily stay on mission in terms of revenue. Make sense?
Gotcha.
One thing I wanna
Go ahead, Matt.
sort of put out there, you know, we could, instead of trying to think about where we meet in the middle, say it's 3 and 3 by 2020, you know, there's been a lot of ideas about how do we get development, how do we do this, how do we do that, all of which costs money, which we don't have. So instead of just focusing on coming to break even, especially if we're asking for more money, we need to come beyond even because we need a better value. You know, like you said, we're not gonna say, give us more money to do the same or less. So, you know, I'm not too worried about what they cut or don't cut, because we're gonna have a sell either way because we need to do more with this money. Or else it's not gonna pass. People won't want, they're gonna pay more with the same, so.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Jeff, what are our opportunities to get more grants into the city and doing what Joe and Scott did, is talk about in terms of attaching our expenses to those grants? Is that an opportunity? Secondly, I look at Tom sitting across the table. Is there any merit in calling together the people who have invested in this city big time, get a focus group together and say, okay, what are we doing well to help you do more? What are we not doing well that's holding you back from doing it? And, you know, we have a lot of generous people who really put the effort into the city. If we really ask them, okay, guys, what do you need? How can we help?
So to answer your question about the grants, we are constantly looking for grants. We receive public safety grants in the general fund. And the challenge with grants is there's a funding cycle and then what? And, you know, so you can kind of view them as non-reoccurring. And so that's gonna, you know, be the challenge is unless you continually get those grants, you're gonna, you know, eventually that revenue's gonna go away. And
Yeah, I agree that we have the same problem, but I'm thinking of, for example, what Carl's talking about. You know, if we could get a grant that would really give us a jump start, that would generate new ideas and new opportunities, and it's worth that one-time investment. And that's what
Yeah, particularly if it leads to something revenue generating.
Exactly.
okay, I see that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, let me just ask this. We've got some time between now and our next meeting, which is the first Monday of July. We've talked about a number of things that people want information on. It seems to me that, so let me just ask the panel, what kinds of work or what kinds of information would you like to have when we come back in July so that we can move this forward?
And my assumption is the city team is gonna fill out what details in the matrix that they can, so that it's, we know it takes a vote of the public, or it
Right.
changes city
Yeah.
charter.
Yeah, so
So
I think-
they're going to fill those things out, or generate $1 million for this, or,
Right, yeah.
so we've got that.
Yeah, yeah, so I think if the matrix becomes, to get the matrix as complete as possible.
And keep in mind, across the top of the columns, we can continually add to those too as we come up with areas we want to evaluate something on. So-
Yeah, and let me also just say, what we thought would be helpful in the matrix at this point, although we might expand it, would just be to capture it, not evaluate it. You know, in other words, what this group's gonna have to do is some very serious work with pros and cons. And maybe that'll later be added to the matrix, but at this point, if we're just saying, you know, the Headley rollback is worth X number of dollars, it is recurring, requires a vote of the people, and so on. I mean, so it's gonna be more factual than evaluative, if I could say it that way.
If we could have a column, this may not work, but I've just finished a new book and I'm fascinated by this idea. The book is Essentialism, and it essentially says the first thing you have to do in your life is figure out if something's worth it or not. So if there could be a column where we can, as a committee, begin to evaluate, well, here's something we could do. Does anybody really believe that either the revenue it will generate or the opportunity to get it through whatever the process is there. And so we can clearly say these things they're there, but as my friend Blaine Lamb would say, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And so that we know that just because they're on the list, not all things are equal. So let's spend our time on the things that really need this committee's work and capacity.
So worth the juice?
Yeah, that's right.
We'll get
The
that
juice would
comment.
be cash, the squeeze would be the voters' approval of that.
So it's kind of subjective, but a 1 to 5 on the difficulty of doing it.
Yeah.
Also, is it possible, I don't see in our materials, to have the city's vision statement for the next 5 years as well as your goals and objectives? Because I think that it's easy for us to have this discussion, but if we're not pushing toward what you think we need to do, then, or at least understand it for cross purposes, I would like to see that.
Okay, and that does exist, so thanks.
Could there also be a category sort of on time frame of implementation, so that we know, you know, in addition to looking at, is it worth our time, is it going to happen in the next 5 years, or is it something that's really not going to get us a return for another 5 years? Not that we can't talk about both, we should.
No, yeah.
But so we know that we're addressing the immediate need and the long term.
Well, especially if you talk, for example, about infill.
Yeah, exactly. That's long term.
That's not gonna hit the 16 tax rolls, but it might be a really good thing to, you know, in terms of long term. So a time frame of consideration. Thanks, Matt.
We want to, Plant Moran mentioned a checklist.
Yeah, we did.
I haven't seen that. What they gave was kind of a non-exhaustive list, so if we could get those and add those to the list, so that you could all see that.
We also may do some sorting of this so that it's, you know, I don't know if these should be in order of most value to least value or easiest to hardest, but we'll think about what's the way to present this in the most digestible manner, if that makes sense. And I'm sure we'll get some feedback if it's not. Yeah. We might band it into time frames or something like that. Okay. I think the goal here is to keep this as usable a tool as possible. So, okay. Anything else that we need to think about between now and the next time? I'm going to go back to our panel. I'm going to just say, Scott, Joe, anything as you've been listening to this that you want to add? And Brian, you're in the index.
I love some of the creative ideas that we have going around. I don't have any additions there.
Okay, Scott?
What he said.
Okay. Brian, anything?
I mean, I've got some questions that were asked earlier that I'm
Yeah, so
it's more information on, but other than that,
Okay, thank you. And I would just like to thank the Upjohn Institute as well as Plant Moran and you gentlemen and whatever backup behind you. Let's give them a hand.
Last thing, I don't remember whether we wrote this down as information we needed or not, but somebody had asked a question, 1% income tax, we're going to do what that might generate.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things we'll consider.
Okay, I don't know.
I want to make clear though that we'll use 1% just as a plug number, because to Mike's point, it's not like we have to think of it as being a percent.
Right. Tim, there's also a couple of models also where there's all those employees in the city and then non-resident employees in the city.
Right.
I think you need to also as well.
Well, and there's also there's also, we'll have to factor in, because there's a provision in the charter that if there is an income tax, the millage rate has to come down under the charter.
And can you obligate future city commissions to not increase it?
That's a good question.
And number two, with regard to the income tax, it seems to me you're going to have to evaluate the people that would be paying the income tax in the city of Kalamazoo. I think there's a lot of poor constituency here that pays no income tax. And So somehow you would need to come up with some demographic to determine if that is possible, what kind of generation you can, enhancement you can get from it. And then on the other side, the rich will move. They're the ones that pay the income tax. What kind of historic shrinkage that you have? Simple to move the portage, so that would happen. There's got to be some statistic somewhere that shows the.
Yeah, that's to Rod's point too. Yeah, it's one thing to generate the number, it's another thing to evaluate the pros and cons. Ben?
Could there be, I guess, some research into maybe being creative with Renaissance zones and income tax, how that would work? I know
They're
there's
not
some.
allowed by the state anymore, it's not an option.
It's not an option? Okay, all right. Well,
There's
that
no
answers
new
that
ones.
question.
That was a very short piece of research. we probably won't get all our answers quite that definitively or that quickly.
Well, you're assuming Andrew is correct.
He is. So, thank you for that. Any additional points we need to cover? Our next meeting will be back at Metro Transit. It's the first Monday of July.
Just so you're all aware, this document this is going to be a working document, so we'll continue to add to this based on the questions, and this will be updated based on that. So, and shared with you in advance of the upcoming meeting. So we'll get on a good cycle here of getting information out early. We got a couple of meetings back to back, so we had a tough schedule to get things together, but we will get that back on schedule.
Richard, the discussion about the taxes, residents a little bit, if we ever look at something like sales use tax, that's a percentage more. There's more taxes for those who can't, don't pay for those taxes. Income tax, you don't level it a certain level of income, it's reduced tax, but I don't know what that means.
And that's under state law, and we're not allowed to do that locally. But again, part of it, what we talked about is with advocacy, maybe something, we can still add it and have that reality. Yeah.
Yes.
Can an income tax be imposed on only people that work within the city versus all who work and live in the city? It has to be all residents.
That's under state law.
So I thought someone said about that.
Actually, it's residents, it's people that either live in the city or it's people that live in the city and people that work in the city.
Yeah, but not only one.
But you can't do one or the other.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead, Clive. Yeah, it'd probably be good to get a lawyer to talk about it.
The city income tax is a statute that if it is adopted, we have to follow the statute. And there is very little that you can do as a municipality to change things. There's a couple of options that you can do. And one of them in terms of making the first X number of dollars exempt. So you can have a little control over the exemption. But the first $1,500 is exempt. You can take that off. The other is, in terms of the rate, we're paid. We can't change the rate. So it's 1% for all income on city residents.
Is that 1% maximum, or must be
1%?
It can't be less.
Can't be less. 1% from all. 1%. I'll check that, but I'm pretty sure it's 1%. And then for non-residents who work in the city, it's 0.5% of what they earn in the city.
So if you're a city resident and you have retirement, you pay income tax on that. But if you're somebody who works in the city but lives outside the city, you wouldn't pay on any other income.
Correct. Now, and I don't know about retirement income. That's got a little changed a little bit.
Capital gains.
Capital gains, right? Dividends. Capital gains. If you are a city resident, you would pay 1% on your capital gains and your interest income. If you live in Portage but work in the city, you'd only pay 0.5% on what you earned in the city. And there would be.
So it really is dramatically higher for city residents than it is for
city,
Even if you lower the
employers.
millage rates, you could still get more.
Here's the other thing that comes into play. If you are a city employer, you would withhold, just like you do withhold state and federal. But if you are a city resident, but you work elsewhere, then you have to pay that quarterly payment. You have to self-report, because there's nobody withholding it for you. If I live in Kalamazoo, but I work in Papaw, my Papaw employer is not going to withhold city of Kalamazoo income tax. I've got to do that myself.
So we'll charge Clyde with double checking whether it's possible to do less than 1%, but his initial impression is no. Okay.
It's on all in.
Thank you very much. We've still got, as you know, a reason to meet and some work to do. So have a good several weeks, and we'll see you in July.
I apologize, I had another thing that I.
Thank you.
I know what I was. Thank you.